This is also in a state of kind of chaos. I admit it's still a preliminary stage, and I don't know where this is going to go and whether this is going to go anywhere or not. So please excuse the messiness. And again, I think that some of the things that I find the most important are still the most undeveloped. And interestingly, they have to do with the same things that Neil found very important and very undeveloped. And these have to do with conceptualizing interspecies touch. And this is where I seem to kind of lack the tools necessary to do that. But still, let me tell you what I have, and then maybe you can help me with some tools. So the emotional support animal. This is a term that has recently been making headlines in the media, mostly with reference to crazy attempts to pass off members of various unusual species as ESAs. That is, as animals that airline passengers need to lessen their anxiety while flying. This is a term that works, or a category that works only within the United States of America. And I have gathered quite a collection of these media stories about emotional support animals. I'd like to give you a sample so you can see for yourselves. These include stories about flying with pigs. This is from the New York Post. Interestingly, this is a story that has haunted the internet. It kind of keeps coming back. This original story of the woman being kicked off the plane took place in 2014, and I have seen it posted in 2016, 2017, and 2018 as well. So the pig story is like a recurring almost meme. Flying with a turkey. This is Yemi, what we just talked about, an emotional support turkey on a Delta airplane. There have been attempts to fly very recently with a peacock. This is Dexter the peacock. The story of Dexter, this is his Instagram page. He has an Instagram page which I follow. I'm a huge fan of Dexter. His owners are actually artists in all reality, and this was something of a provocation, of an artistic provocation. However, Dexter was not admitted on the Delta plane on which they wanted to take him, and they had to drive Dexter all the way from New York to LA. There are also more scary stories. This, for example, is a story of a hamster that was certified as an emotional support animal, which ended up being flushed down the toilet by its owner after the hamster was denied entry on a plane as an emotional support animal. So the certification was rejected. The girl killed the hamster because she couldn't take it on the plane with her. This is very recent. This is February 2018. This is an article from The New Yorker where writer Patricia Marks has tested the boundaries of acceptance for emotional support animals in public and wrote an article about it, where she flew with a pot-bellied pig. She went shopping with an alpaca. This is an alpaca. She also went shopping with a boa constrictor and a turtle. Most people associated with the world of service dogs and many members of the general public are outraged with the very existence of the category of emotional support animals. And I am in no position to question the righteousness of this anger, which results from the conflation of several factors that fuel the negative responses to the already sensationalized media accounts. And here are the general reasons. This is another one with the pig, where you actually see the pig on the plane. This is the 2014 pig event. Disability faking. So while emotional support animals are supposed to ease the anxiety of an individual human with a diagnosed mental, psychological disability, the ease of obtaining certification for one's animal as an ESA results in a general perception of the owners of ESAs as faking a disability simply to be able to keep their pets close to them in locations that do not allow pets. In these media accounts, the owners of the unusual ESAs are presented as con men, swindlers. Class privilege. The ease of obtaining certification for one's dog or other animal is clearly tied to one's ability to obtain a medical certificate confirming disability, which can basically be purchased even online if one has the necessary resources, meaning money and or social connections. Misrepresentation of the human-animal bond. That is of the particular bond between this individual human and the individual animal as especially close and therapeutic. This is particularly obvious, glaring, I would say, in the case of exotic species of companion animals. We see these stories and we ask ourselves the questions of, will flying with a peacock really bring down one's anxiety related to flying? and in accounts of the easy reclassification of the animal or even its disposal in situations where the ESA certification is rejected, so the hamster being flushed down the drain. And the last factor that I think is part of this outrage is this perception that these animals are not really doing anything. The misrepresentation of the animal's presence as work, the assumption that because the animal does not appear to be engaging in performing work tasks, his or her presence is not beneficial for the human. And what I would like to do in this presentation is to disentangle these reasons. That is, I'm not saying it's illegitimate to react this way to these stories. Of course it's not. But I would like to disentangle one of these threads, the last one, though feel free to ask me about the other ones as well, suggesting that lumping it together with the others is basically a loss of an opportunity to ask some difficult questions that have to do with the character of animal labor and with the relationship between training and the status of an animal as a working animal. In fact, the emergence of emotional support animals in the US and the controversy surrounding their status can be seen as a catalyst of something more than just outrage. It brings to the surface certain tensions that would otherwise remain buried. It explodes them and forces us to confront them. And these tensions include the character of the services provided by the service animal to the human. There is the gradual recognition of effective labor or animal care work, small letters, well, anyway, in response to the accusation, but they're not doing anything. There are issues that have to do with legislating animals' effective labor. How do we do it? The status of specialized training as a benchmark for evaluating the service animal's usefulness in the therapeutic process and the animal's acceptance in certain spaces. The issue of species as a benchmark for acceptance in public space. It is absolutely not coincidental that these media stories are about unusual companion animals. Trainability is associated with dogs, not with pigs or peacocks. Is that rightly so or not so much? And again, there's not going to be much time, I think, in this presentation for this, but you can always ask me in Q&A. Regulation of the presence of companion animals in public space in the US, and I'm not going to have much time to talk about this as well, but the US is actually very restrictive when it comes to allowing animals in public spaces, for example, transportation and so on. The point about training here, which might seem somewhat incidental, is really the one that drew me into this topic. I have recently finished working on a manuscript titled Genealogy of Obedience, Reading North American Dog Training Literature 1850s-2000, which is forthcoming with Brill in the summer. So naturally my focus is on training. Not only on the methods, but on the changing functions training serves and has served. And it seems that in the case of service dogs versus emotional support dogs, the tangible distinction in all legislation that differentiates ESAs from service animals is the specialized training received by the service dogs. Here you have a slide with the different types of different classifications of dogs mostly, although animals, companion animals, therapy animals, emotional support animals, and assistance dogs. And you can see that the difference between emotional support animals and assistance dogs is training. So trained in tasks supporting the handler's disabilities, and I'm going to elaborate on this. The different labels, of course, confer different rights of access onto the differently classified animals. Service dogs, including psychiatric service dogs and medical alert dogs, are allowed to accompany their handlers everywhere, specifically in places which normally restrict the presence of animals, grocery stores, libraries, public transportation, etc. ESAs, on the other hand, are granted two, and only two, major exemptions. They can be housed in accommodation that normally does not allow pets, in result of a precedent in interpreting the Fair Housing Act, and as a result of an interpretation of the Federal Air Carrier Access Act, they can accompany their owners in the cabin of airplanes free of charge. It is this second privilege that has generated the greatest hostility, and some U.S. airlines, aided by new guidelines issued in January 2018 by the U.S. Department of Transportation, are beginning to restrict the list of species that can serve as emotional support animals and to reserve the right to remove a disruptive animal. The major source of anxiety related to ESAs is their potential inability to maintain rules of decorum in spaces populated by humans. These outrageous images of pigs defecating on planes, turkeys gobbling on buses, and even yappy dogs nipping kids in airports fuel public outrage and the sensational news snippets about ESAs. In this narrative, training is seen as a certain caesura. The trained animal body becomes both sanitized and civilized. Training is a guarantee of the body's non-disruptiveness in public space, of its docility and usefulness, two words that should immediately evoke Foucault's discipline and punish. One of my major arguments in Genealogy of Obedience is that while Foucaultian discipline may have been the best way of thinking about dog training in the US in the early post-World War II decades, it is absolutely insufficient now. And I would like to take this analysis in a direction that proves that the caesura of training in the case of American ESAs versus service dogs is a smokescreen and not the tangible distinction legislators have set it out to be, and results from the legislators' inability at conceptualizing and consequently regulating the effective labor of animals. However, the first point, the one about increased though gradual recognition of service animals' effective labor, correlates with the third, the one about training. It is not coincidental that the methods of training, both of pet dogs and of service dogs, have changed significantly at the same time as humans' relationship with companion animals has become redefined. As we move away from the disciplinary mode, training begins to be recognized not as the formation of a docile body, but as the building of a two-way affective relationship. These processes are part and parcel, they are inseparable. Increasingly more research suggests that the very presence of a companion animal can indeed have a beneficial effect on humans, but both on those with mental and physical disabilities and on those who do not qualify for such a diagnosis. This general beneficial effect has absolutely nothing to do with the animal meeting requirements of specialized training. If anything, it is rather non-specialized training or good socialization that strengthens the effect. It makes sense that any human feels calmer with an animal that is also calm and under control, that is trusting and cooperative, and not one that is reactive, fearful, or aggressive. However, the dominant tendency is to view the unconditional love and non-judgmental support offered by a companion animal as something natural, for which no training whatsoever is required, just love. This is evident, for example, in the public's overwhelmingly positive responses to stories of psychiatric service dogs, where the emphasis in these reactions is not so much on the awe with the trained animal's skills, but on the implied healing power of animal love. Here are a few Amazon reviews of two books about psychiatric service dogs. Carlos Lewis Montalvan's Before Tuesday. This was a significant book, one of the first books written about psychiatric service dogs. And Julie Barton's Dog Medicine. These are responses, Amazon reviews. I thoroughly enjoyed this book. Reading The Behavior of Tuesday reminds me of my dog, who is not professionally trained. Fortunately for me, he is a self-appointed caretaker. Since after a leg amputation I am definitely disabled, he has helped me through spelling original, me through some pretty rough times. Or look at this one about Julie Barton's book. Julie's book wrecked me in the best way. Her writing sings when she writes about Bunker, and you want her to do anything for him. For those of us who love dogs, we know what a wag of the tail, a poke of the nose, a crawling into a lap can do for the spirit. A dog saves us without knowing he is doing so. He's just being a dog. The rest is a kind of magic, which Julie captures so amazingly in Dog Medicine. Or this next one that at some point says, for me, it has reinforced my opinion that animals are the greatest healers. There is no judgment or criticism, just unconditional love on a continuous level. The point I am making here is that when people read about these animals or see the animals, they're not focused on what the animal can do. They're focused on this relationship being an expression of love. If the animal's presence is beneficial in ways that can be and have been measured and quantified, influence on heart rate, pulse, breathing, and in those which still remain unquantifiable, then the animal must be doing something, even if he or she does not appear to be doing anything. If we accept the premise that the animal's presence has an effect on the emotional state of the human, then we must recognize that the companion animal is performing some kind of work. The question is, what kind? A vocabulary that seems to be promising for speaking about such work was coined, for example, in Michael Hart and Antonio Negri's Empire and Multitude, where the authors try to conceptualize shifts in the post-Fordist economy, speaking of effective labor as the kind of labor that is immersed in the corporeal but produces effects that are immaterial. Hart and Negri speak of the work of service industry employees who are expected to produce an effective reaction in the recipients of these services to make them feel good. Such labor, however, has been best explored on the example of care work, and there exists an entire strand within feminist thought that speaks of the immaterial labor of women, caretakers. I choose to take up the term effective labor from Hart and Negri because it complements my Foucauldian reading of the changes in animal training, but I do not disregard the feminist accounts of care work. Recognition of animals' effective labor is beginning to be a topic that is discussed in the academy. See, for example, Kendra Coulter's recent book, Animals' Work and the Promise of Interspecies Solidarity, though there she speaks of emotional labor, so coins a term of her own. But the recognition of companion animals' effective labor is very rare on the legislative level. We can basically only spot it in the internal guidelines of the particular organizations that deal with animal-assisted therapy and animal-assisted interventions, which specify the conditions for therapy work as labor, mandating a particular length of the workday, breaks, rest, etc. The category of the emotional support animal is one of the few designations that seem to somehow address the need for recognizing the effective labor of animals. However, its emergence also opens up a Pandora's box of issues. Should this labor be regulated? How? Where does effective labor begin and where does it end? How can we, without a shadow of a doubt, establish whether the animal is engaged in effective labor or just chilling out on the floor? These issues are not taken up in regulations concerning the presence of emotional support animals and service dogs in public space. The emotional support animal is seen as doing something, but not really being at work. Specialized training continues to serve as a benchmark for which animal counts as a labor and which one does not. However, upon closer examination, it becomes obvious that this criterion is not as clear-cut as many people, often including service dog users, see it. This is a criterion that seems outdated because it is associated with a bygone era, or to use a more Foucauldian vocabulary, with a regime of power that has ceased to be the dominant one. The meanings and functions of training have evolved over time, as has the use of dogs in therapeutic contexts. As Neil has described, the official use of dogs in the US to help disabled persons began with Seeing Eye in the 1930s and 1929. It's only in the 1960s that dogs began to be trained as hearing aid dogs, the training of assistance dogs helping disabled persons who were not vision or hearing impaired, but lived with a disability that made it difficult for them to independently carry out certain daily tasks, took off only in the late 1990s. After the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which defined a service dog as any guide dog, signal dog, or other animal individually trained to provide assistance to an individual with disability. Note the significance of individually trained. Also note the progression of the uses of guide dogs and the changing vocabulary used to describe both disability and the services provided by the dogs. So we begin with dogs who help people whose vision is impaired. The definition is then extended onto dogs who help those who are hearing impaired, until finally, only in the 21st century, service dogs officially begin to help people with mental disabilities, a field that is pioneered by the coupling of veterans, former soldiers from the Afghanistan and Iraq wars suffering from PTSD, with psychiatric service dogs. The existence of PSD dogs became better known after the publication of some memoirs by Afghanistan-Iraq veterans and also some movies. By following the development of the field of service dog training, we can trace the gradual extension of the understanding of disability from strictly physical impairment to inability to function effectively due to mental illness. As the category of disability begins to be applied to humans with no obvious physical impairments, the task of classifying which animals count as service animals and which do not becomes pressing. If disability can be invisible, How do we determine if the dog accompanying a particular individual in places where the presence of dogs is restricted is a legitimate service animal or not? And these are U.S. Department of Justice guidelines for interpreting the Americans with Disabilities Act, which states that service animals are defined as dogs that are individually trained to do work or perform tasks for people with disabilities. And then you have the examples of these tasks. And the next fragment, which is highlighted, the work or task a dog has been trained to provide must be directly related to the person's disability. Dogs whose sole function is to provide comfort or emotional support do not qualify as service animals under the ADA. It should also be mentioned that in the US there does not exist one accredited organization certifying service dogs, or even an official list of certifying bodies. In fact, certification of a dog as a service dog is not required by federal law. Neither is its identification as a service dog. Some states may have certain requirements related to certification. For example, Alaska requires that the animal be certified by a school or training facility for service animals. But Illinois only requires that the dog be trained in obedience and task skills. In most states, it is both possible and legal to train one's own service dog. Yeah, I have many here. And here's some book covers of books that help people train their own service dog. So consequently, situations may arise in which not only is the human owner's disability invisible, but so is the dog's status as a service animal. In all of these cases, the fact of the dog having been trained to perform certain tasks directly related to a human's disability is officially the decisive factor. By the way, note that training your own service dog, this is something that shows how not only the training has changed, so it has shifted from this kind of production of a docile body. You have a school that applies certain techniques and creates a certain product, to a situation or to something that is a process that emphasizes this relationship building quality. So this idea of training your own service dog also fortunately kind of corresponds in time with basically the emancipation of disabled persons. So this idea that a disabled person does not need to have somebody train the dog for them and then go through this entire process of transferring, but that they are perfectly capable of training a dog themselves. And that is also that also kind of is a quicker, faster and cheaper method of supplying service dogs. Okay. However, if we go back to these U.S. Department of Justice guidelines, which were here, I'm sorry, the only questions that can be asked of someone who comes into a facility that is a no pets facility with a dog, the only questions that can be asked are these. Is the dog a service animal required because of a disability? And what work or task has the dog been trained to perform? Any inquiry beyond these two questions opens up organizations to litigation. So in other words, legally, it is the correlation between the service that the dog has been trained to provide and the specific disability that accounts for the dog's special status and the rights of access it brings about. The dog is a service dog because of the training it has received. And it is the training which enables the dog to successfully fulfill the requirements posed to service animals. However, when we look at the list of tasks potentially carried out by PSDs found in the guidelines of the Psychiatric Dog Service Partners Organization, which deals with the training of such dogs, the two most common tasks dogs are expected to perform are pressure therapy and tactile stimulation. Grounding, for example, is also another example of such a task that is not clearly a work task. Pressure therapy refers to a dog pressing against a handler's body with her own body, while tactile stimulation refers broadly to offering one's body for petting. While these activities can be quantifiable as work tasks, as this list shows, it takes a lot of mental effort to do so. In the case of psychiatric service dogs, the purpose of quantifying care tasks is securing the dog's status as a working dog, which can happen only if the behaviors are conceptualized as resulting from the process of training. Consequently, the rights of access granted to service dogs by the ADA are extended onto such an individually trained dog. And again, this is clarified by the Department of Justice guidelines this way. Question. If someone's dog calms them while having an anxiety attack, does this qualify it as a service animal? It depends. The ADA makes a distinction between psychiatric service animals and emotional support animals. If the dog has been trained to sense that an anxiety attack is about to happen and take a specific action to help avoid the attack or lessen its impact, that would qualify as a service animal. However, if the dog's mere presence provides comfort, that would not be considered a service animal under the ADA. If the dog has been trained to detect an attack, then he is a psychiatric service dog. If the dog simply detects an oncoming attack without training, then he may be an emotional support animal but not a psychiatric service dog. As it is fraudulent to misrepresent one's dog as a service animal, and there does not exist an official body certifying psychiatric service dogs, the distinction between committing fraud and not committing fraud seems to rest not on whether the dog can or cannot detect an oncoming panic attack, but on whether the dog has been trained to do so. The legislators seem to place a lot of faith in the power of training, to the extent that training seems to possess a certain magic, most certainly the magic of category shifting. But there's also a certain insufficiency in these definitions which the above example brings to the surface. The mental calisthenics required in presenting the act of hugging one's dog for support as the dog's performance of a quantifiable work task is necessary because the growing popular recognition of animals' effective labor has yet to be reflected in legislation. Training, as I said in the opening of this talk, is a word connected closely to the functioning of the disciplinary regime. It is Foucault's word of choice, the French original being dresser, which we of course know in English as the discipline of dressage for horses, but that's the term he uses in the original in Discipline and Punish for speaking of the formation of docile bodies, human bodies. In fact, it seems almost a cliché to speak of dog training as Foucaultian disciplinary power applied to non-humans. All the features of the disciplinary regime are apparent in the practice of classic obedience training. It is tied to the rise of institutions, the dog training school. It is directed at the body, molding it into docility through detailed procedures for pressing, pushing, jerking. It is necessarily coercive, and its goal is increasing the body's utility and docility. It relies on surveillance, normalizing judgment and the examination, the leash, the crate, the obedience trial. It is tied to the presence of the body in a series of distinct spaces, the home, the school, the obedience ring. In the case of pet dog training in the US, the refinement of disciplinary techniques associated with the rise in popularity of obedience training was accompanied by a major shift in the function training played. In the post-war decades, companion dog training became a popular practice embedded in the project of governmentality, of ensuring the safety, health, and overall well-being of the urban human population. The trained animal in this framework is also something of a product of the disciplinary institution. Discipline is, after all, famously impersonal. We put the raw material in, disciplinary techniques are applied, a finished product in the form of a trained dog comes out. For a short time in the 1950s and 60s, when the idea of obedience training was at its height in the US, training loomed as a ticket for canine access to the public sphere. It was suggested that more trained dogs would result in less need for legislation of canine presence in public space. Blanche Saunders, a famous trainer who was also known for launching obedience trials in the US, wrote, "When training has become an accepted part of every dog's education, and when owners as well realize their responsibility, there will be less need of city and state legislation to control their pets." While this idea of universal dog training proved futile, the use of training remains, at least overtly, a measure of an animal's acceptability in public, all the more potent when it pertains to special purpose animals. It is not coincidental that, with the exception of airplanes, the ESAs do not have rights of access to the public sphere, but they are exempt from no pet policies in housing. The private sphere is where the non-trained animal belongs. The public sphere is not. This is how guidelines for university administrators explain the distinction. You have that footnote there. There's a valid distinction between the functions animals provide to persons with disabilities in the public arena, performing tasks, enabling individuals to use public services and public accommodations, as compared to how ESAs might be used in a student's dwelling, For example, ESAs may provide very private functions for persons with mental and emotional disabilities. Specifically, ESAs by their very nature and without training may relieve depression and anxiety and help reduce stress-induced pain in persons with certain impairments. Conversely, persons with disabilities who use ESAs may not need to take them into public spaces covered by the ADA. The logic governing this argument, not only this argument, but the general understanding of emotional support animals is faulty. Why should one's home be the space where relief from anxiety is most needed? In fact, the most common narrative about the effects of emotional support animals is that they help their humans deal with the fear of leaving their house and serve as social facilitators. And this is evident in many of the case studies of actual emotional support animal use. These are stories of people who were afraid to leave their house and, thanks to the acquisition of a pet, often from a pound, finally began to leave their house. While no special training, other than a good rapport with one's companion animal and some very basic obedience training is necessary to achieve this therapeutic benefit, access to public space is certainly needed in order for the therapy to be effective. Conversely, in the world of dog training, hardly anyone continues to see training through the old framework of enforcing obedience. Training is no longer a strictly disciplinary enterprise. It is not the mechanical formation of a docile body, but a modulation of the animal's will. While training remains goal-oriented, it is also no longer exclusively task-oriented. It is not only about ensuring the completion of certain work tasks, it has become primarily a vehicle for shaping the animal's attitude, for increasing willingness to cooperate with the human, and for installing habits that cannot be quantifiable as work tasks and yet that make all the difference in both a dog's comfort in the public sphere and the comfort of being with that dog. For example, self-control exercises, so teaching the dog not to chase squirrels, cars, and whatever. Service animal trainers know this, and this is why the work tasks list is so convoluted. It is next to impossible to quantify the immaterial labor of a service dog, and yet it has to be done to satisfy the legislative requirements. While it is clearly not exclusively the specialized training that makes a good psychiatric service dog, it is also impossible to say where training begins and where it ends, especially in a context in which it is legal to train one's own service dog. It seems that there exist two stories that run parallel to each other: the story of natural love that needs no training, and the story of the magic of training. The story of natural love that needs no training is also a story of the private. This is a story of the emotions. The story of training that ensures access to the public sphere is a story of animal presence in public. And training here seems to serve this magical function of making it possible for the animal to transgress boundaries, to go from the private into the public sphere. But there is a but, and the but is that these stories are strained. Each one of these stories is strained. It is not the specialized training that makes service dogs behave well in public. It is basic training coupled with a trusting relationship with the handler. And it is also impossible to be receiving comfort and support from an animal that is uncomfortable, him or herself. That is, from an animal that has received no training. So to answer the question I posed in the title of this talk, which is this a scam or are these dogs working? It seems that emotional support animals could technically be both. Dogs that work in a big scam that allows middle-class Americans to save on plane tickets and pet deposits. However, in order for an emotional support animal to provide emotional support, the animal must not increase the owner's anxiety in public, which an unsocialized or otherwise reactive animal most certainly would. The difference between the behavior of a true emotional support dog and a service dog is not an abyss. It should be negligible. While we should most certainly work on closing the legal loopholes and lobby for it if that is possible at all, that make the acquisition of an ESA too easy, the very idea that animals, even those that are not highly trained, can provide support and therapeutic benefits to people with certain psychological conditions is not outrageous at all, even if they are turkeys. And neither is the idea that these animals are working. And I believe we simply need to theorize ways of speaking about animals' effective labor, and that it is also in the animal's best interest that we do so, rather than continue to emphasize this magic power of specialized training. That's it. Okay.